welcome everyone. I think people are just joining in. This year, OTU is exploring various topics of urbanism on a month by month sort of thematic exploration. And this month, we are exploring the idea of finding urbanism, which is about investigating, socio-spatial cultural dynamics to inform the planning process. And really, what does that even mean? So today we have invited three of our most active volunteers, and you may or may not already know them, but there's Shobita Jacob, Olivera, Petrovic, and Shaharin, Annisa.
So I began as an architect, studied from School of Planning and Architecture in New Delhi. Then I worked in India on earth and architecture, mostly rammed earth and earth blocks, did residential and institutional buildings. Then went to US, studied at University of California, Los Angeles on urban design. And then over there, my main project was urban development for Haiti, where we developed, finally we actually went and built infrastructure pods, which would help the people over there. Post working in US, I shifted to Oman and have been in Oman for like 5 years now. First, I worked at Matra Development Proposal. We worked at the company over there, 23 Degree North and David Harper Architects. Post that, I worked at Zamani, where we focused on developing heritage assets across Oman and East Africa.
Hi, my name is Alia. I am coming from Serbia, where I also was training for an architect. But then when I finished my master's, I actually started working in planning profession. And I mean, what I studied was architecture and planning, but I specialized in architecture. Then I was doing internship in planning department of the capital, urban planning. And at the same time, I started together with a group of people that studied with me. We started an NGO which was doing participatory projects with local community in Belgrade. So we continued this practice for 4 years after our studies. It was completely voluntary. We worked with cultural organizations and institutes mainly, and with local community, of course. And we completed like one big project per year in average, let's say. And after that, I got an opportunity to come and work in Oman in German University as a research and teaching assistant. And over there, I also got an opportunity to work on one project that involved the local community in the process of design of public space. So this is where I gained my experience in such projects like that implement ethnographic approach.
So I grew up in Oman actually, and I tell everybody I am Omani from my heart, but I was born in Bangladesh. I studied architecture and planning at GUTech, and then I worked there as well as a research assistant for 2-3 years, especially developing the Eco House project. And during this time, I was also involved. My passion then was architecture and urban architecture at that point. And after that, I moved to Germany to do my master's. And during this time, during the studies and afterwards, I've been involved in various participatory development projects. The first project I was involved in was in Egypt, in Cairo, working with informal settlements, understanding the needs of informal settlements, and then developing further on. And after that, I moved towards specialization in migration and development of informal settlements. So during my master's, I worked very closely with migrants in Oman as one aspect, where we worked also a little bit with participatory tools and methods to understand the housing needs and spatial needs by Bangladeshi migrants. And currently I am a lecturer at the University of Stuttgart and coordinating the master's program of integrated urbanism. And on the side, keeping up work on the participatory processes and migration in sub-Saharan Africa, currently Zambia. So that's where I am based right now. And of course, a very proud member of OTU. And in Oman, my experiences with communities was more under the framework of this foundation of Muscat Space Lab, where we worked with the communities in Al Khod 6.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Shaharin, for joining us. Thank you all of these lovely ladies who have been a part of OTU, from at various points. Really excited that you could make it on this panel. Just to start things off, I just wanted to walk everybody through the fact that, we're trying to explore not just, aspects of urban planning. Here, we're always trying to understand the community and society. And the main idea of ethnography and really understanding socio-spatial aspects has to begin at understanding the culture itself. And I know that each of you has had very different experiences from all over the world. So it'll be interesting for us to sort of get a perspective from outside of Oman first. But like in regards to when you had to understand the context of the place and, through whatever projects that you work with, what kind of techniques that were used to understand the whole situation before? Like, what were some of your experiences that you can relate to in using such techniques?
Yeah, I mean that's a really, I think one of the main focuses which you mentioned now is quite important to not, we as architects in the traditional studies, we are designing, planning, we do some analysis, but I think the idea of social analysis is very much, let's say, the last 20 to 25 years. So it's quite new in our field of study, whereas sociologists are really the ones who were in the past working on it, right? So that's why it's such an important aspect to not just separate spatial analysis and social analysis, but actually combine them to see how both of these affect each other. So one of the traditional things I think which OTU also worked with are these focus group discussions, which we use as technique, where the main thing is where we beforehand have to identify, let's say, a topic, a focus, and then have the discussion around. Apart from that, what I also have used and which was quite helpful in understanding was what we call life history mapping, daily routine mapping, where you sit with individuals or households as who are your unit of analysis, and you actually keep a very open mind and a very unstructured, I would say, your interview format. And I mean, this goes very well together as one of the ethnographic tools, right? And you start to identify how the life of a person has developed from one stage to another stage, and further on going into detail of how their daily activities have been changing. With this, you then come with certain thematic topics and certain understanding of culture and why people do certain things they do. And then this technique then sets as a base to kind of further ask them questions, since you already have some ideas about the, let's say, the cultural aspects of what we are doing. The next thing, which is a little bit more advanced, which we use is display the city, right? A format where you actually have identified something, have identified a focus theme, have identified what is happening. And then this goes more into the direction of together working with the communities to then see if certain socio-spatial aspects are actually can be progressed.
So, I mean, that's actually quite like interesting, ways and techniques that we use. And I think like in terms of say just, like FGDs or focus group discussions, interviews, etc., that seems to be quite common, like commonly used techniques. But was there any techniques in your experience that maybe worked better or worse, like maybe in project specific situations, say in Cairo, or maybe it's different in Zambia, or even different, in Germany, or wherever you had various experiences?
Yeah, and to this, I think the trick was this: that once you do this initial exploration interviews through mapping, life history mapping, and so on, you identify certain no-go points. And that's when you go into this semi-structured format. So for example, an experience from Cairo was when we started to, during the life history mapping, we realized that there is a lot of women who are staying within the informal settlement and the men are moving out. So from a very Western perspective, you would say, oh my God, the women are probably not empowered or not able to go out of the settlement. But actually, during this semi-structured interview, when you then went into detail of understanding their daily life activities, we realized actually the women are the men of the household, because the men do work outside, bring in, let's say, the economic incentive, but the women are the one who are deciding on where to spend it, right? So through this, this daily routine mapping of the specific, let's say, woman group, we understand that we need some level of depth into analyzing or filtering out some aspects which can work. So that's, I think, one technique. So a mix of this life history mapping and this filtering technique, I would say, which worked. And what doesn't normally work is going with preconception. So that goes along with questions of direct questions. You don't give yes or no questions. We give questions which are more descriptive.
Yeah, and I'd be curious even to hear from Olia and Shobita, like, in Serbia, say, for example, Olia, like when you were dealing with these community groups, and, yours was also a volunteer group, if I'm not mistaken, and, it was a very different approach where you probably had some idea of the culture, but you still had to enter into this, into various communities that you probably hadn't before. Were there any things that kind of were unexpected that you had to understand, or that that you thought you knew but it was different?
For the beginning, it was, as Shaharin mentioned, like it was this coming out of the school, coming out of the university, and this ethnography is itself a concept like that is completely out of the school. So we just finished the university, and symbolically we started this process of doing something completely different than what we learned. So we were lucky to have a community which was very cooperative. They really wanted to make a change, and they were so happy to talk with us. But then we were not really knowing what we are doing, and we were discovering the whole process of how do we design together with them. So we realized that there is three big topics that we need to work on, like that are not, and of course they are intertwined, but they are separate things. One is collection of data, so talking with community and understanding the stories and backgrounds. Another one is analyzing this data, because suddenly this data is not just numbers and yes or no answers. This data is very complex to analyze and to translate into quantitative measurements that you can use later for design. And then the third part is designing and actually exploring the space between community, exploring the relationship between community and their shared space, and also exploring what is their wish, like what they want to build and what they want to develop, maybe not physically build, but what they want to accomplish as a group, and which kind of value do they appreciate together, which kind of life they want to have. So
how did you investigate these things, like all these values and value systems?
I think, okay, the first topic is we had a specific survey designed that was designed more to spark the conversation between you and the person that you are questioning, that was supposed to inspire them to talk more about their private life, their history, what they like, how they live, how they spend their day, what is usually, what things do they carry with themselves when they go to, I don't know, work or to buy a bread or something, like to walk in the nature. And in this way, we actually tried to understand how do they use the space around them on a daily basis, and how do they use the space in special occasions. and how do they interact with each other, and do they, because we were supposed to design a space that they shared together, how do they share this space, and which needs are conflicting and which needs support each other. So this is only possible to understand from stories, not from some
so
simple
easy.
closed questions.
Yeah, true.
Then second part, with analyzing data, we developed a special methodology that was something like now we have in OTU. Like first we were breaking the answers into like we were trying to narrow them down to some keywords and then break them into categories and group them. Then play with these categories, bring them in relationships, understand where are the conflicts and where are the synergies, and then come to some conclusion. And literally every time the conclusion was completely different thing. Like each community had their own story, and each case was very specific. And then the third thing is the relationship with space. What we came to conclusion is that the community works the best with the big physical model of the space. So we would normally build like one really like 1 to 5 model, like that fills the whole room of cardboard, very thick cardboard, a model of their building or of their neighborhood, and then make them like familiarize themselves with this scale, and to show in the scale, like with their hands, to modify the model and to show exactly what they mean, what they like, what they don't like, what they want, etc. So this was, and Shaharin mentioned this play the city model also, with providing them tools that they can use to design the space. So by like making it also a game, you kind of bring this whole topic and the group in some challenge when they need to collaborate in order to come to the common agreement. And they all have the same tools, and they have one coordinator who is leading this discussion, and this game needs to have some outcome, which is in the end like a compromise between all of them and all their needs together.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting that even when you're like you end up investigating these places with and the people, and they actually know their places the best. But then when we reintroduce or communicate it in a more like design environment where they can actually take it and play with it, that's where it gets really interesting. So even being able to communicate their own information back to them in various creative formats is actually quite an interesting sort of way to explore culture as well. Like, and I'd like to also hear from Shobita, like how were your experiences in Haiti? Like not only were you unfamiliar with it, but even the whole project was not specific only to a small neighborhood, etc. It was for a larger scale. So how was that experience?
The project as such was actually initiated by WHO. So they actually introduced our university into going and doing research in Haiti. So it was a funded program from a government point of view. Okay. So we were initially introduced to like government bodies, like US Embassy in Haiti, Water Authority, Electricity Authority, the mayor of the city. So we conducted initial interviews with almost all the government bodies over there. And we began with data collection, which from government, we were literally bombarded with data. We had so much data from government, and we quite couldn't really figure out how to approach the city, or how, as an urban designer, how do we help the city from that vast amount of data. And another issue which we faced was when, say, we interviewed with the Water Authority, they were focused on their issues. So it was very difficult for us to figure out what the collective issue of the people was. So then we decided actually to go and stay there for a month, like watching day-to-day activities, staying there with the people. And that's when we started getting the real on-ground data. Like government data was very specific to their entities. And with what we did was as on a city scale, we put zones. And in zones, we interviewed different age groups. We went to like schools and spoke to students. We went to hospitals, spoke to patients and also the head. So it was through these interviews, which we collected over a period of month, that we're actually able to figure out how the city was suffering, what were their main issues. Simple things like I would watch a lady carrying like water in her hand, and I would just follow her and time. How much time would it take for her to collect water and walk to her house? So simple activities like that, by staying there on ground, we were able to figure out the life of that city, how people were interacting. Yeah, it's not usually possible to live in that neighborhood and then watch and document at the same time, but we were lucky enough to do that. And when we were living there, there were other organizations who were trying to help the city. Like there were tree planting initiatives, so there was an NGO which was working on women and child development. So we would go and talk to them how they were trying to help the city. And we would also get data from their experiences, what worked, what didn't work. So getting that deep data was really helpful as an urban designer for us to figure out. Earlier, even Shaharin had mentioned like spatial analysis is like one layer. We were able to go like many layers deeper, like what were people thinking, how were it's affected. It was multi-layer data through which we were able to figure out what are the main or the root cause where we could try to come in and then help the city.
We've all talked of very similar techniques. There's focus groups, there's interviews, there's some sort of observation, of trying to see what really happens, daily life mapping. All that is also quite relevant to, applying it in Oman, where, we've been trying to do it through OTU as well. But then, like, if you were to sort of even, gauge the effectiveness of these techniques, did they differ between, what you did in Haiti and what it may have experienced in Oman?
In Oman, we actually employed, I would say, a top-down approach, because we were coming in from government data. We were using that data to actually come and, figure out a solution for an area. We were not actually going to the community and collecting data in Oman the way I worked. We would, there was no immersive experience that I would stay there and collect data. It wasn't done like that. We would go from a top-down level. In Haiti, the top-down level did not help at all, because the data was very disparate. Each entity had their own specific data. We couldn't really figure out how was the city functioning. So interviewing at a very basic level, that helped. The bottom-up approach helped. And in Oman, it was a top-down approach. So Oman, we were dealing with historic sites. So we relied on documentation that was done through books which supported us from the government itself, like the spatial mapping, which the government had already done. And we did brief interviews, just maybe a couple of days within the locality.
Right. But then did you feel it helped? Was it enough what you had the data from top down? Because I would think in Oman also the cultural data is not necessarily very robust.
Yes, it wasn't. We didn't have cultural data. I would be very frank with you. And I think that's where OTU can come in and help. The cultural data was missing. There is also people in the company who were Omanis. So they were really supportive and, giving us a lot of information. And we had friends who were giving us a lot of information. So it wasn't like I had to travel to a place to collect the data. I am living in Oman. So there is that difference. So I'm living in the city anyway.
Right.
So in the Haiti situation, I had to travel.
No, while Shobita was talking about the top-down approach as well, it just got me thinking in where also this top-down information comes from. So those are also statistical and quantitative data, right? and which takes, I would say, which is, there is like 1+1 is 2, let's say. It's possible to get done. But I think the qualitative collection of data, since that takes so long and patience, and you need consistent, I think, people who are working, that's the data which is more difficult, I think, to achieve when the process is time-based. But what I wanted to add to that is to your earlier question, Shehla, about how do we contextualize such techniques and tools for the context. I would say not just Oman, but I would also say Gulf region, and also say maybe Middle Eastern and North Africa region. What, from my experience in Muscat Space Lab and this Hamria community, was that one thing that always helped is a contact person. So if there is somebody who's already living in the community, I mean, in OTU's case, maybe Dr. Mona was one of the biggest example of such a contact person who let's say, who holds a stake somehow, very close social connection to the community that helps. And this person doesn't necessarily need to be with us throughout the whole process, but rather do this snowball effect of connecting us with the next contact. And the second most important thing, I think, in my experience, is also, which I think in the entire global south maybe is a little bit different, is that it helps a lot when we focus on certain target groups. So it's not about segregation, but it's rather about putting our knowledge together in understanding women would speak differently when we would have just a woman's discussion. We can have the same, let's say, questions asked again to a men's group, the same questions with a different method asked for children or youth. And this is very effective in terms of a contextual, or let's say localized technique. I think that's one of the most challenging, of course, to identify this, but also very helpful when we ask for such kind of ethnographic data collection.
And then, I mean, from your experiences in Oman, and I know that you actually, you have experiences, going into Omani communities, then, with the focus on the Bangladeshi migrant communities, etc. So then, in like, even though those were different, they were all based in Oman. Did you feel like that there was this sort of difference, not just in these smaller groups within one country, but even country to country? Like, if you had to compare experiences, were there any stark differences in the way that you approached each of these studies and techniques with people?
Yeah. So yeah, this is what I actually meant also with the target group. The technique, I would say the difference between these three contexts, I would say, which if I compare it, is a socioeconomic level. So depending on the socioeconomic level, at least in my experience, there is also different entry points with the same techniques. So for example, in Zambia, the focus of my work at least is informal settlements. So these would be the lower economic strata, whereas in the context of Oman, it's either middle or even higher upper class. So it then varies on which kind of target group you talk to. And the other aspect I think is important, which happened in the context of Egypt, I would say, is you need some certain level of permissions, legal questions, which needs to be sorted out before you can actually employ your specific technique. So that the approach of choosing the target group, I would say, is the biggest difference in the technique.
Actually, that's a very interesting point, because I remember once when we were talking about talking to different people from ODU to figure out how to do FGDs of focus groups. There was one suggestion which was about it was a little off because if you do ethnography, you want to blend in, you want to really not stand out and be someone who's just coming to observe you, but be part of the whole community. But then there was this suggestion that we should actually be able to identify ourselves quite clearly and be open and transparent in what we're doing, and not try to sort of hide in the shadows and be trying to be a part of it, but actually coming in with another notion. Did you experience anything like that?
Yeah, transparency, right? And that's also the thing, what transparency means in different contexts. And here I would again bring in, that's where the cultural capital is so important for us, I think. So the same question, I will just give an example of a mental map, which we used as a technique for, I think, at least in Oman and in Zambia. So when it's about how much it's not about how much you explain, but the language you use to explain. So for example, in the Zambia context, my question for this mental map of understanding where the people are collecting water from in the well and where the people are dumping the waste was to ask them, the question is, could you please draw me your routine from the morning to the evening? And then to guide them through it. Whereas what I had done in Oman was to actually guide them through the process of giving a context-based. Could you please tell me how your water system works? Could you please tell me how you contact the yellow truck or blue truck or the green truck format? Because in one context, so the context of Oman, people have a higher human capital, so they actually understand such terminologies and they do it themselves. Whereas in the context of Zambia, it's not what everybody is very used to. And so over there, my entry point is more in this general long question typology.
Interesting. Yeah, so you have to actually change your approach based on what you're dealing with in the communities, and I guess it can be different even within the community itself. Maybe certain target groups, like you said, would react in a certain way, from others. What would you say is your experience, Olia? Like when you had been working in Serbia, and then when you came in and were dealing with communities in Oman, what approaches seemed a lot more different than when you were in Serbia?
Two main things that I mean, the first thing was actually the same. It's just a different role in the community. Is the contact person that Shaharin mentioned. Like in Serbia, it would be usually the president of community group or the president of the building, because we have such positions in communities. Like each building has a representative, like apartment building, I mean, has a representative that always organizes meetings in the building. They take care of the maintenance, and I mean, they organize the maintenance and other things. They solve issues of all the dwellers. And then this person was our main contact. This person actually reached out to us. So it was a very specific communication. And also there was a local group, like also non-governmental organization, and the president of that group was also our main contact person. Well, in Oman, we figured out that one of the best ways is to try to reach the Sheikh, because once he endorses the project, then the whole community is interested in project. So he kind of always listens to us, what we have to say, and then he gives either he gives his endorsement or he says I'm not interested, which never happened. he usually they're interested to see what we can do. And then also it's good to have another person who is more connected to the neighbors, like to the neighborhood, and to have actually one male person and one female person, because they have different roles in the community. Also, what we figured out is that men usually gather to do some physical work or to solve some issues with the space, and the females, they usually resolve social issues, and they collect charity, they do charity work and stuff like that. So these are two completely different spheres, and it's good to have one contact person in each of them. Also, as Shaharin mentioned, we noticed that we cannot easily facilitate a group session. Focus group session if the group is mixed gender group. It's better to, in order to give to everyone an equal opportunity, it's better to separate groups, because maybe they will feel more like if they're just men or women.
Yeah, I find it quite interesting that even though these are all urban scenarios, it's not like there's some remote places that require a specialized understanding of these are like, say, city centers or at least urban hubs of some sort, in different areas. But the approach can be so different where like, whereas you mentioned in Serbia, you have, the building president or the society presidents, and so those kind of civic authorities which are already established or which are already there are those entry points. But in Oman, because that concept of building society or a neighborhood society or these kind of civic bodies are not yet, I feel, formalized or thought about, you have to then go in with the who are the community leaders, who are really the insiders, the neighbors and everybody who's as attached. So you might even come across scenarios where when you don't have a traditional community or an older community, you have some sort of like a newer neighborhood, and you have so many of these new neighborhoods popping up in Muscat and the rest of Oman. If they don't already have these trust systems, and there is no presence of a civic body or those sort of systems either, then where does culture even start to get defined? And that's actually quite also something I think that we all have to kind of think about in our in our work and in this whole idea of investigating social spatial dynamics. I would like to also just move on to what's been happening in OTU. I mean, all of you have been quite involved with OTU, and I mean, it's not been a lot of work and deep diving. It's just been pure volunteer based. I have some time. I'm going to spend time in OTU, but then so I just want to get maybe some some sort of insight from each of you about how this sort of deep diving and trying to define culture and cultural information can be very different from quantitative and survey data. And I think like a lot of people we have come across in ODU would say like, we would probably go in and ask them what they want, what do they like, what do they don't like, and kind of ask them very direct questions. But we are sort of going in from a much more broader perspective, like how, like, can you throw some light into how and why this would work if you're dealing with cultural analysis and for planning?
When we were trying to analyze, say, the culture of a very urbanized area with where the public infrastructure is very well developed, it's quite difficult to get cultural data of such a place because without several points of contact, it becomes very difficult. Whereas in an area, say like Old Gala, where the community is quite close-knit and you can connect from one person to another, data gathering becomes very easy. So in a very urbanized center where the urban infrastructure is already very well developed, systems are, like our current methodologies, I would say, is quite difficult. Where we have to establish several points of contact, and it takes a lot of time and effort getting those contacts. So that is one area which I was just thinking where we could like work on, which methodologies can we utilize to approach in that scenario, because so much of our past experience have been in close-knit communities or where we could approach different people, even like people on the streets, we could like speak to them. But if it's in a heavy urban center, the data is quite tough.
That's true. Yeah, the approach kind of really changes and becomes more complex if it's an already established and highly dense area. Then where do you even begin?
Yeah.
If you're talking, I mean, the base you asked before about quantitative versus qualitative. So just before that, I think just when I always think of the quantitative part, for me, it's just the body, and the qualitative part is always kind of like the soul, which is harder to get to. But of course, makes you who you are, right? I mean, we all can be women, men, children with the same physical structure, but the soul is different. And it's very hard to get to this qualitative part. But I think what we also do in OTU now, looking at the qualitative part, going through the whole process of coding and, you know, a second level of coding and a third level of coding to actually identify what is this, the soul of this area. We are really trying to understand what is the actual need of the people and what are the wishes, because these are actually two different things. I can wish for having a rocket for myself or living in Mars, but do I actually need this or not, right? So I think the process of what we did so far, also in the Miro board, is to kind of identify what is there on ground, what is possible. And the quantitative data supported us, right? But it was not everything that meant with the area, but we are somehow able to now filter out these real needs of the people, these real connections of the people through the process of qualitative data analysis. I think that's one of the biggest strengths of OTU. And like Shobita mentioned, and like also what you mentioned before about this rapidly urbanizing societies. So I would add one layer to what Shobita said. One was the close-knit Gala village. Let's say the other one is this Mabela new network. And the other one is these new neighborhoods, which is coming out of the land lottery process, where there is very difficult to have one jotting point. I think one of the big technique that could be used is this zonal mapping of not where they are situated, but actually where they come from. And that's kind of, these are networks which are like this, you know, we don't call it these tribal connections, but we still have tribal connections. People from Sharkia are coming and, I don't know, getting land in one part of the area. So I think our focus somehow also needs to switch a bit when we go to such rapid urbanized communities, to actually see, can we hold on to some networks which already existed in the past, and do they exist now again? Maybe that's one way to, how do you call this? Comprehend all the data together.
Yeah, and I also feel like, you know, when we dug into Gala, and I felt like that data in itself didn't seem to exist in any sort of open data or accessible data. And why we wanted to formalize this as data itself was, you know, so just so that people, you know, they just grab a database and say, fine, I'm going to load it and then analyze it on a machine. That is actually qualitative data that comes into a machine, and not, again, you know, just demographic, man, woman, child, etc. You know, and I think that in itself is quite an interesting exploration. I mean, I know that, you know, researchers, universities, and have done so much, you know, like so many studies on this, but for some reason it doesn't come into the planning, you know, like on the field planning, like in these companies or in the government. It's sort of very, you know, okay, if you like to read and you like to investigate, then you may be able to find some sort of documentation, but to bring it as a tool and as usable information and make it mainstream data is quite a task. And so all these approaches become so different all of a sudden.
All the time since I joined OTU, I have it in mind. Here, the social profile of communities is completely different than what I face in Europe. And not only talking about where people are coming from, Omani people, like which tribes are they coming from, but also the fact that communities in Middle East are so fluid, and like if you look at the moment, there is, like, let's say 50-50, 50% local, 50% expats. Those locals are here all the time. Expats come and go. So this 50% is so fluid. And how can you evaluate one community when it has a big part of it constantly changing? And also this changing part is so diverse. I mean, maybe you have like big expert communities of this or that nationality, but then you have a big fraction that is completely mixed and brings so many backgrounds together and so many different needs and expectations out of space and the city. And that is something really unique that I've never seen in any other place. And I think that even like situation in Oman is different than situation in UAE, is different than situation in, I don't know, Qatar, Kuwait. So you have these different fluid profiles of
Yeah.
community that needs to be assessed, I think, with completely different criteria. So when you say that somebody is a local, what does it mean? Is that a person who is also Omani national, or is that an expat who lives longer than 10 years? But then if you have expats coming only for 2 or 3 years, why don't we call them also locals?
Yeah.
And what also this big question, when does a place become a home to someone? So
Yeah.
these are things that are very interesting for me to, and I'm very much interested to explore them further in our future research.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point you brought up, because I remember we were, I think, each of us trying to figure like what are the profiles, because we have this sort of an table of profiles we must cover to in all our interviews. Then there's this question like, okay, what is the duration that they should have been in the community to be considered resident? And so we said, okay, 10 years or more. But then only I brought up saying, well, if you're an expat, 10 years or more is quite a big ask. Shouldn't it be something lesser, maybe 5 years or more? And then we're like, okay, so is 5 years enough to call it home? And then I said, okay, fine. Let's just say it is, if you're not like, if you're used to moving from place to place and finding quicker
Yeah,
connections, possibly.
exactly. Because if you use this criteria of 10 years living in one location, if you apply it on this big fluid group, you will get 0 participants in the
Yeah.
survey, and then you completely exclude 50% of community just because of this criteria of 10 years residing in one place. So we need to look more carefully into our criteria. How do we choose participants, and how do we like
really account for that?
evaluate their
Yeah.
answers?
Was my main research topic about the community building, segregation, inclusion, about expats. One most important thing, I think, if for our qualitative data is also the top-down policies, processes, and approaches, actually, that they also affect if they are part of the community or not, because there are not direct processes and policies, but there are some, let's say, hidden processes and policies which are supporting this idea of, let's say, not 100% being in part of the community. So when we approach, I think, looking at that expat population now, by expat, I just don't mean no skilled workers, but also high skilled workers in this case. It's also important to understand quantitative data and how that fits into our information. And in that case, somebody who lives in the area for 10 years to judge if this person is, how do you call, a local or not, maybe is not the, like Olya said, maybe is not the right parameter, but rather the network of the social network of this person and how far it reaches, because that is what, I mean, when you go to the definition of what a community is, that is works, right? So I think in the case of the expats, we have to be also a little bit more careful in the selection of these parameters and terminologies, because it's not the same as of the Omani nationals, and it's not the same across the different economic strata. Right. They're quite, there's quite a different level of information that defines that for them.
And I would say that, like you even mentioned before, there are these sort of embedded tribal systems, so which mainly means that people are connected to place. So you see that a lot in the Omanis within various communities. They have, they are from one place, but then they have land and house somewhere else. So their sense of home is a little spread out. It's not central or singular. It's okay, well, this is my house right now, but this is my family home, this is my ancestral home, and they have so many home identities. So there's a lot of complexity we're dealing with, and like Olia said, like rightly said, it's highly fluid. So even if we say, okay, well, the Omani nationals may be easier to handle, actually it's still quite complex there. So it's like the whole 100% is almost getting a bit more complex than usual, but that is what I think would make it very unique if we can crack that. How do we investigate and make sure that it's really effective investigations and outcomes are really true to define these cultural experiences?
It's like culture of a region is actually influenced by people flowing, like the floating cultural mixes that people bring from different places. So we can actually look at impacts of people coming to Oman, like say within cuisine or within like festivals, or there's a lot of impact that the floating population is actually bringing into Muscat or the entire Oman.
I really, really like that sentiment. Like Karak, for example, is now Gulf, right? But actually, if you really see where Karak comes from, masala chai, no? I think that's a really nice, I think the way of grasping this two population to actually see the impact.
And in Oman, I feel like it's quite a unique experience. It's not that it's the same in the UAE or in Qatar or in Saudi. In Oman, because of its historic connections with trading and even with colonialism and the spread of the kingdom, and like everything has already mixed and made this place quite welcoming to all sorts of backgrounds. So even the Omanis are of such a rich cultural mix within the Sultanate. So, and plus there's this in and outflow of expats. So defining public space activity, defining cultural activities, defining experiences, seasonal, daily, etc., can become quite exciting if you can only document it the right way. So that's quite cool. I would like to just quickly open up the conversation to anybody who has been part of the audience. If they have any questions or any opinions to share, please unmute yourself and go ahead.
Okay, one was related to collecting data and asking the community. So I guess one of you said that you usually ask about private life. So what do you usually focus on? Let's say if you're asking someone about their private life.
I think it depends. So data collection, the main takeaway would be it's different at which phase of the research this question is asked. So if you are asking this question in the exploration phase, it would be about, can you tell me about your daily life? What are you doing? But if it is now in the more mature level of your research and data collection process, you already know that this person is coming from Sharqiya, but works in Muscat in an oil company. Then the second level of your question for the same data collection would be, could you please tell me, I don't know, the route you take to the office, the route you take to Sharqiya, and so on. So you keep it quite open in the beginning, and at the second phase, you try to narrow it down as much as possible, trying to focus on a specific or two specific things that comes out of your first level of analysis.
Okay, thank you.
Olia, Shobita.
Yeah. There's also data which is freely given to us as urbanists through form of stories and where residents actually tell us what's going on in a place without us actually asking specific questions. So there's that data as well. I'm just adding to what Shaharin mentioned. It could be where they like to hang out or how much time they like to hang out in a specific place. We may not ask that question, but we still get the data.
Just that whenever in our way of making the service, whenever we would try to find out something about the personal life of someone, it would be aimed only for discovering what represents a value in their life. Is it a family? Is it a career? Is it some special hobby that they have? Or like what is their wish? What do they appreciate? Because this is in the end what they will recognize as a good space, as a good public or shared space, if it accompanies whatever they want to do or want to have in their life.
Okay, Okay, thank you.
I could add, it's not exactly, I would say, personal life. I would say the data is more towards how a person interacts with the city. It's that interaction data that is what we focus mostly on.
Okay, the other question is, you said that you would collect the data, let's say the usage of the space, correct? Then you would design based on the usage. Now, in the future, there are some might changes coming. Let's say in the past, people are using, or even now, they are still using cars as a transportation. But now, since there is scooters, there is also bikes are coming. So how would you consider for the future, like designing also, like other aspects?
Like I would say that what happens with the when we're trying to understand the cultural dynamics is that we try to understand what is already comfortable, what makes sense to the people, and when we propose these new mobility solutions, for instance, and you say, well, that has to be more cycling lanes, and so everybody must start cycling now. On what basis do you make such a decision? Is where the cultural data and dynamics really helps, because what if there is absolutely no presence of cycling, and maybe the cycling is only done by certain user groups and not certain others? How do you understand if that will be really the solution of the future? That's actually what makes it more relevant to do this sort of cultural analysis in the first place. So you can have progressive or like say the future of design solutions coming in, but that's where it stops coming from your head and rather comes and emerges from the data itself, and it may help you then understand that, okay, before I give a cycling lane, I need to understand who's going to be using it, maybe start with kids, and maybe the best place to place the cycling lane from the data that we gather already, they have an easier uptake for newer things, and they already have certain routes that they end up taking. So I think that's where you should be looking at it. Like the cultural data helps these future solutions make sense.
Because we're talking about mobility, Salim, maybe I can just give one example. I'm not saying this is the best example, but maybe just to explain your answer. If we look at what Shehla also mentioned about mobility, I think when we design a process, it's very need-based, right? Because in our qualitative and ethnographic work, we are always looking at what is the need? What is the need? We don't just plan something. But during this design process in the large scale, we need to also leave some space for improvement and adaptation. Because it's very clear when you look at Misfat al-Abreen or Alhambra that was designed and lived for a specific need at a specific time, which is, there was, let's say, very hardly room for improvement with the big gap in the transition in let's say, in our lifestyle. But this room for improvement and adaptation is very important. You see it very much now when you look at the planning of Mabela, Al Khod, Mawale. We have the roads, two-way streets, one way to go, one way to come back. And then you have the villas, but between the road and the villa, you have what now is a parking spot. It's the space right in front of the houses of the people. But originally, this was designed as a road reserve, right? Imagining that the traffic in this area will be quite high and this space will become the second road. But now what we see with this adaptation and let's say the room for improvement, these are the spaces which are actually taken up for cycling, taken up for outside gardening, taken up for fixed parking, but it still belongs to the government, no? So I think in just talking about in the macro scale, that when such spaces are designed, when we get so much information also from communities, some aspects need to be kept more loose, and so that the communities can also take over depending on their needs in the future.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Great. Thanks so much for those questions, Salim. Anyone else would like to go ahead, or if you have any opinions to share, please feel free. Okay, so I guess that's that's all the questions probably. But I really hope that this session was informative and enlightening. Thank you again, Shobita, Olia, and Shaharin for joining in and making this such a good discussion and very enlightening.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having us.
Thanks a lot. Super nice.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone. I think it was a very interesting discussion also to have between ourselves.
Very good. Okay. Okay. Take care, everybody. We'll speak again soon. Bye.